The spirit of critical thinking says, there is a logic to this, and I can figure it out. So said the late Richard W. Paul. In today's podcast, we'll explore the idea that every domain of human thought, every subject, at its root, makes sense. When something makes sense, you can understand it and not just memorize it. When something makes sense, you can use it in practical ways. I believe these things. This is the heart of my view of how learning works. I wrote a whole book about this very thing. Hang on for a stimulating 20 minutes or so as I take on a doubter, cognitive psychologist Daniel Willingham. Cognitive psychologist Daniel Willingham, in Chapter 6 of his book, Why Don't Students Like School?, asks a question and then challenges the thinking behind the question. Quote, what can be done to get students to think like scientists, historians, and mathematicians? This protest against school curricula has a certain plausibility, but a flawed assumption underlies the logic, namely that students are cognitively capable of doing what scientists or historians do. End of quote. Students are not cognitively capable. That's a strong challenge to my view that teaching should always be done within a way of thinking. Biology is a way of thinking. History is a way of thinking. Mathematics is a way of thinking. Certainly, those types of thinking are very different in some respects, but underlying those differences are fundamental similarities. When I say a way of thinking, I mean each shares 9 components. At its core, a way of thinking is to adopt a point of view with a particular motivation to answer certain kinds of questions. To think like a historian is to look at the past, to try to construct an explanatory narrative to answer a historical question. Such a question might be, what factors led to Germany precipitating a Second World War only 21 years after the First World War ended with its defeat? A way of thinking also speaks to the assumptions practitioners make, as well as what their fact base and framework of ideas consist of. A biologist assumes basic principles of chemistry, such as atomic structure. This is an area of active questioning for a chemist, but not for a biologist. The fact base for a biologist includes the reality that life is organic, that is, it is carbon-based. The ideas that enable the answering of biological questions include the cell theory, that all living things are composed of cells and the smallest form of life is a single cell, and the central dogma that DNA controls life through the manufacture of RNAs, most of which enable the production of proteins. The final components of thinking include explanation, as well as immediate logical implications and longer-range applications or consequences of certain actions or processes. If we flip back to historical thinking, historians will answer the question about the short interval between the 2 world wars in terms of social forces, political leaders, economic conditions, etc. That's what it means to explain if you're a historian. Logical implications might include the way the military contributes to totalitarianism. Consequences of authoritarian regimes might be diminished economic output, loss of personal freedom, etc. These 9 components come into play in any subject matter when you're thinking as opposed to trying merely to absorb assertions. They're equally true of novices just starting out and experts with decades of experience. Most thinking within working memory consists of information from sensory channels interacting with ideas pulled up from long-term memory. Again, this is true of raw beginners, and it is true of seasoned practitioners. Certainly, the fact base and the framework of ideas are much larger for experts, but the process of building ideas and logically linking them together, including chunk formation, is the same for everyone. With this background, Willingham's cognitive principle number 6, quote, cognition early in training is fundamentally different from cognition late in training, end quote, is a disruptive proposition. Willingham says the assumption that there is continuity in cognitive processes from early to late in learning is, quote, flawed. He maintains, quote, students are not cognitively capable of doing what scientists or historians do. Willingham doubles down. Quote, it's not just that students know less than experts, it's also that what they know is organized differently in their memory. Expert scientists did not think like experts in training when they started out, end quote. That's quite an assertion. So what are these differences in cognition early and late in intellectual development? Well, he references a flawed traditional science curriculum on page 144 as evidence of what students are cognitively unable to do. We don't ask students to actually do science because they can't, seems to be the message. In other words, the traditional curriculum is merely an accommodation to a cognitive limitation. As a cognitive psychologist, he should know better. This is not about fundamentally limited cognitive processes in beginners. Rather, it is about a fundamentally flawed curriculum. When immersed in a curriculum rooted in answering compelling questions through purposeful, systematic building of a fact and concept base, students do learn to think like scientists. They're embedded in a junior version of the real game. Their thinking can be expert-like, but it will take perhaps 10 years of effortful study, continually tackling the challenges that are just beyond their current competence before they're in striking distance of true expertise. I would be the last to denigrate expertise and put it in reach of virtually anyone. My alarm bells go off when I hear people with almost no science knowledge talk about doing their own research about raw milk or vaccinations or the value of hand washing. Don't even get me started. For a glimpse, you could go to my first season podcast, What Makes You an Expert, recorded in the early days of the COVID pandemic. Expert-like is enough for lay people to try out the authentic thinking of a scientist, historian, economist, etc. Learning within a way of thinking adopts a point of view with a motivation to answer the kinds of questions an expert answers. Certainly not with the same depth of understanding of an expert, at least not at the outset. In the process of working within the framework of a way of thinking, students should learn intellectual humility. They aren't always equally good at all types of thinking. If all of their school subjects are taught as ways of thinking, students are embedded in different points of view with different assumptions, different questions to answer using different explanatory systems. In truth, most significant problems involve contributions from multiple viewpoints, that is, types of expertise. The development of interdisciplinary concepts can lead to new insights. It leads to well-roundedness. Well-rounded means improved ability to interact productively with those who aren't like you. One of the areas that never attracted me is history. My lack of interest was due to the emphasis on names and dates and other facts to memorize for a test, and then forget for the rest of my life, or so it appeared to me. It was like smelling salts when a friend who is a historian told me she was not big on names and dates either. She was upset at the way history was taught because it misrepresented what it means to think like a historian, and it killed interest in most students. While history doesn't explain like science, It does seek to construct a causal narrative. While history cannot repeat controlled experiments as we expect in science, it can look for parallels between different events in the past and even developing situations in the present. In that sense, it seeks to predict. History is not science, but it seeks to answer questions that science is not motivated or equipped to answer, questions that humanity would like someone to try to answer. One of the illustrations Willingham uses to establish the differences between how novices think and how experts think is from the TV show House. Gregory House, MD, is a diagnostician par excellence. He is also the embodiment of Willingham's curiously constrained view of what constitutes expertise. If you can't match wits with Dr. House, you can't think medically. That eliminates not just novices, but virtually all of House's colleagues. Willingham adoringly says, quote, House can access the right information from memory with great speed and accuracy. It's information that the more junior doctors have in their memories, but just don't think of, end of quote. If junior doctors have the same information as House, how did it get there? If, as Willingham says elsewhere, quote, experts actually think in ways that are qualitatively different from novices, end quote. Expertise is in the eye of the beholder. In many families with no other reference point, nurses are medical oracles. Junior doctors are treated as experts by many patients they treat, just less experienced experts. The reality is that the information-dense medical school curriculum is to blame for their limited diagnostic skills, not their cognitive limitations as mere junior doctors. Willingham speaks of having the right information as a doctor, but information is quite different from ideas. We've talked about this multiple times this season. This lack of clarity plagues much of cognitive psychology. The brain stores ideas, not information per se. Knowledge is justifiable belief. During grand rounds with senior medical staff, physicians in training experience a curriculum that finally gets around to an emphasis on logic and problem solving that should have been core to increasing proficiency in learning to think like a physician. Junior physicians haven't been adequately prepared for this transition. Willingham observes, quote, beginning medical students can recognize patterns of symptoms they've memorized, but they don't think functionally. So, when they encounter an unfamiliar pattern, they aren't sure how to interpret it. End of quote. Once again, this does not point to a cognitive limitation that invariably accompanies beginner status. They don't know how to think functionally, that is, in terms of cause-effect or what we call physiology, not because they can't, but because it isn't an emphasis in the early medical school curriculum. It could be, and it should be, but it isn't. I'm still looking for Willingham to specify exactly what is fundamentally different between the cognition of beginners and that of experts. Real cognitive limitations can't be overcome by curriculum, but my life work with innovative curriculum has repeatedly shown me the contrary. When curriculum embeds students in answering compelling questions, a discipline, that is, a way of thinking, a discipline was invented to answer such questions, and if it scaffolds the systematic development of robust conceptual frameworks, novices make rapid progress that surprises and satisfies them. That's what hundreds of my students mean when they say I taught them how to think. Specifically, I taught them how to think like a biologist, even if only for one semester. Willingham defends a short list of cognitive attributes that he says distinguish expert thinking from that of novices. Among these attributes are the ability to determine the important from the relatively unimportant, the ability to think in terms of cause-effect rather than mere descriptions, and the ability to generate hypotheses and test them. Willingham summarizes by saying, quote, "We can generalize by saying that experts think abstractly." He says, "Remember that in Chapter 4 I said that people find abstract ideas hard to understand because they focus on the surface structure, not the deep structure." If Willingham were consistent with his thesis of a profound discontinuity between the cognition of neophytes and that of experts, he would have said abstraction is out of reach of newbies because of intrinsic cognitive limitations. He didn't say that. He said, quote, "Abstract ideas are hard to understand because the novice focuses on the surface structure." Focus can be changed by what the curriculum prioritizes. As I developed in podcast number 4 this season, abstraction is always created from the concrete, and we do it all the time. Concepts are abstractions. Novices who are not thinking conceptually have only a welter of information, that is, a surface orientation, and it doesn't have much structure. Concepts, however, exist in interconnection with each other. Conceptual organization is how we think. That's what instruction needs to focus on. All the attributes of expert thinking Willingham identifies are within the cognitive range of newcomers. It is only a difference of proficiency. No one should argue that novices are just as capable as experts. 10 years of practice counts. However, no one should argue, as Willingham does, that novices are cognitively incapable of thinking like an expert. What frustrates me most about Willingham's writing is that he waffles at the end of his arguments. We've seen that earlier this season. He equivocates in this chapter also. The last major heading of the chapter is unwarranted by his argument. He says, quote, "How can we get students to think like experts?" What? He's been arguing that can't happen. Now he says, quote, "The key ingredient to becoming an expert is extended practice," end quote. Practice what? You practice what you're capable of, not what you're unable to do. How do we bridge the hypothetical gap he set up when he said, quote, "What students know is organized differently in their memory. Expert scientists did not think like experts in training when they started out," end quote. As the chapter closes, Willingham imagines dialogue with those he has failed to convince. Quote, "You may say, I just want them to understand some science. That's a worthy goal, and it's very different from the goal of students thinking like scientists," end of quote. Well, my response is that science is a process, not a product. Have you heard of the stereotypical scientific method? That's shorthand for scientific thinking. To understand some science is to personally and individually construct the logical justification for an idea and to marshal key experimental evidence that supports it. Willingham pats doubters on the head. Quote, "A more modest and realistic goal for students is knowledge comprehension," end of quote. Well, you can't have knowledge without comprehension. Knowledge is justifiable belief. It's only in the justification that you show true comprehension. A few sentences later, Willingham concedes, quote, "Students can also understand how science works and progresses, even if they are not capable of using that process well," end of quote. Not doing it well is a far cry from not having the cognitive capacity to do it. Expertise grows by degrees over time. It is developmental and continuous. There is no momentous cognitive discontinuity that stands as a developmental obstacle along the path to expertise. For many of you, this podcast will land just before or during your spring break. I'm going to take one too. The next episode will appear in your feed on April 26th as we move toward the conclusion of this season. We'll discuss Willingham's cognitive principle number 7, quote, "Children are more alike than different in terms of learning," end quote. Willingham has a very strong position on learning styles, and I find his work convincing. I'd love to hear from you with questions or suggestions for podcast topics. Go to my website, deepanddurable.com, to contact me. See you soon.